In the year 39 AD, the sun rose over Rome, but the city did not wake. It was as if the great capital of the world was holding its breath. Down in the Suburra, the usual roar of the markets, the haggling of fishmongers, the clatter of carts, the shouting of laborers seemed dampened, muffled by a heavy, invisible blanket. It was a silence that carried weight. It was the sound of a million people terrified to speak the name that was on everyone's mind. High above the dust and the fear, the Palatine Hill gleamed. The white marble of the imperial palace caught the first light of dawn, glowing with an almost supernatural brilliance. To the common citizen looking up from the mud of the streets, the palace looked like Olympus, distant, beautiful, and serene. But the Palatine was not heaven. It was a witness. From its 7 hills, the palace stared down at the city like a stone beast, guarding a secret too dark to be whispered, even in the safety of one's own home. Inside those walls, the air was different. It was stagnant. Something was festering in the corridors of power, not a simple rumor of courtly infidelity, nor the standard political intrigue that had defined the Roman Republic for centuries. This was something else. It was a shift in the very atmosphere of reality. The veteran senators, men with scars from foreign wars and eyes hardened by decades of political survival, walked the halls with their heads down. They were men accustomed to the changing face of power, but what was happening now had the power to make them tremble. Some claimed to hear whispers echoing through the colonnades at night. Others said the shadows in the palace corridors stretched longer than they should, concealing things that were not human. But beneath the superstition, everyone agreed on one terrifying truth. The empire was changing, and it was twisting into a shape no one recognized. Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. He had ascended the throne at 24, a golden boy amidst the wreckage of the past. Rome had been exhausted by the gloomy, paranoid final years of Tiberius, who had ruled from the shadows of Capri. When Caligula took the purple, the city exhaled in collective relief. He was young. He was the son of the beloved Germanicus. The people celebrated him as a liberator, a break of sunlight after a long winter. He was destined, they said, to restore the lost dignity of the empire. And for a moment, he did. His first acts were the stuff of dreams, spectacular gladiatorial games that lasted for days, public pardons for old enemies, tax rebellions crushed not with swords but with gold, promises of a new era of transparency. The mob in the Circus Maximus screamed his name until their throats were raw. They loved him. But while the multitude cheered in the sun, inside the Palatine, a shadow was growing. It was not a sudden darkness, but a creeping twilight. It was a shadow made not of chaotic madness, as history often simplifies, but of cold, calculated decisions. The Romans believed that power illuminated a man's true character. In the case of Caligula, absolute power acted like a magnifying glass, focusing the sun on dry leaves. It ignited a desire to mold the world, and the people in it, to his most intimate, impenetrable will. In the heart of this transformation, a hidden mechanism began to turn. It was a silent gear in the machinery of the state, and it always began the same way, with the arrival of young virgins at the palace gates. Officially, it was the highest honor. To serve the emperor, to be close to the divine family, was a dream for any Roman household. But extra-officially, it was an enigma wrapped in an uncomfortable silence that stretched from the highest patrician villas to the plebeian tenements. The marble walls of the palace, so admired by poets and travelers from the East, became mute witnesses to a system that no one dared name openly. While Rome slept, covered carriages would ascend the winding road up the hill. They carried girls dressed in white, their hearts fluttering with a mix of nerves and pride, confident they were heading toward a life of privilege and sanctity. They did not know they could not know that they were crossing a threshold where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. They were entering a space where purity was not a symbol of virtue, but a currency. A place where innocence was a requirement, but also a tragic destiny. The mystery of the Palatine was not born of public executions or blood spilled in the streets. Caligula was smarter than that. The horror was born of the unbridgeable void between what was said and what was actually happening. It was the gap between the official propaganda of the Golden Age and the reality of the midnight screams that were stifled by heavy velvet curtains. It is a void that, even today, 2,000 years later, provokes a chill. Because behind every embroidered curtain, behind every fluted column of Carrara marble, lay an uncomfortable truth. What looked like glory was often just a beautifully decorated trapdoor into the abyss. And it is precisely here, on this threshold between appearance and shadow, that our story begins. To understand the magnitude of the system Caligula was constructing, we must look past the madness of the history books and observe the cold, industrial mechanism that fed it. This was not random cruelty. It was a system. And, like any system, it required raw material. To understand the mechanism, we must first understand the architect. And to understand Caligula, we must look beyond the caricature of the raving lunatic that pop culture has sold us. The monster of the Palatine was far more dangerous than a simple madman. He was a survivor. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he grew up in the military camps of the Rhine. A mascot in miniature soldiers' boots, Caligula. But the cute nickname hid a childhood of unimaginable trauma. He watched his father, the great Germanicus, die under suspicious circumstances. He watched his mother and brothers be exiled, starved, and murdered by the Emperor Tiberius. Gaius survived by becoming a chameleon. He learned to smile when he wanted to scream, to flatter the man who murdered his family, to hide his intelligence behind a mask of submissive pleasantry. For years, he lived with a knife at his throat, knowing that one wrong word meant death. When he finally took the throne, that knife was removed. But the fear didn't leave him. It inverted. The boy who had been powerless became the man who needed absolute, total control over every breathing thing in his vicinity. The Romans believed that the emperor was the first citizen. Caligula decided he would be something else entirely. He didn't want to govern Rome. He wanted to consume it. The transformation was subtle at first, like a crack in a dam that looks like a spiderweb before the flood. In the early months of 39 AD, the atmosphere in the palace shifted from administrative efficiency to a strange, feverish hedonism. But this wasn't the joyous debauchery of a feast. It was the heavy, suffocating indulgence of a man trying to fill a bottomless void. Historical accounts, often dismissed as exaggeration, describe Caligula wandering the vast corridors of the palace at night, unable to sleep. He was an insomniac, haunted by the ghosts of his past, pacing the marble floors and reportedly speaking to the moon, demanding it come down to embrace him. This image, the most powerful man in the world, alone in the dark, commanding the celestial bodies, is the key to understanding what happened next. If he believed he could command the moon, what were the daughters of Rome to him? They were not citizens. They were not people. They were clay. And he was the sculptor. The shadow that grew within the Palatine was not just violence. It was a philosophical reconfiguration of reality. Caligula began to erase the lines between the divine and the mortal, the private and the public. He started to view the aristocracy not as his peers, but as his livestock. And like any farmer who takes stock of his herd, he began to feel entitled to the best of the breeding stock. It started with his sisters. The rumors regarding Drusilla are well known, but they serve as a prologue to the wider system he would build. When Drusilla died, something in Caligula finally snapped not into chaos, but into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He realized that if death could take what he loved, he would take whatever he wanted while he was alive. He would replace the intimacy he had lost with a forced intimacy he could control. Thus, the inner court was born. It was not a political cabinet, it was a collection. Caligula's desire morphed into a mechanism. He didn't just want women. He wanted to break the will of the families that thought themselves untouchable. He realized that the ultimate display of power was not taxing a man's gold, but taking his daughter. Gold can be earned back. The honor of a lineage once stained is gone forever. By taking the daughters of the Senate and the Equites, he held the very soul of Rome hostage. The terrifying genius of this plan was that it didn't look like a prison. It looked like a party. He began to renovate sections of the palace, creating spaces that were physically isolated from the administrative wings. These weren't dungeons with iron bars. They were gilded cages. He commissioned architects to design rooms with acoustic perfection, where music would float through the air, masking the sounds of weeping. He ordered the importation of specific luxury silks from the East that were so sheer they were deemed scandalous by conservative Romans. Perfumes that were heavy and narcotic. He was building a stage set for a play where he was the only actor who knew the script. The elite of Rome watched this transformation with a paralysis born of confusion. They were accustomed to tyrants who killed for politics. They didn't know how to handle a tyrant who destroyed lives for aesthetics. Caligula's behavior became a dark mirror of Roman society's own values. Rome was a patriarchy where the father held the power of life and death over his household. Caligula simply said, "I am the father of the fatherland, Pater Patriae." Therefore the entire empire is my household, and all your daughters are mine. He took their own laws and twisted them until they strangled the very people who wrote them. The selection process was the engine of this new reality. It wasn't a frenzy of lustful kidnapping in the streets. It was bureaucratic. It was organized. It was terrifyingly calm. A specific department was essentially created within the imperial household. Men who had previously tallied grain shipments or managed the aqueducts were now given a new task: inventory. But they weren't counting sacks of wheat. They were counting young women. They began to compile lists. The shadow of the emperor fell first on the registry books. Spies and informants, which Rome had in abundance, whispered names into the ears of the praetorians. They spoke of a beautiful girl in the house of a Valerius, a striking niece of a Cornelius, a pristine daughter of a merchant who had made a fortune in olive oil. No stratum of society was truly safe, though the focus was often on those whose submission would bring the most pleasure to the emperor: the proud, the noble, the highborn. Caligula, sitting in his chambers, would review these descriptions with the detachment of a man ordering furniture. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even looking for simple pleasure. He was looking for quality. He wanted the best, not because he cherished it, but because possessing the best proved he was a god. The decision to summon a girl wasn't made in a fit of passion. It was often made during the day, between meetings about troop movements in Germania or grain supplies from Egypt. He would point to a name on a wax tablet, break the seal of his authority, and set a life-altering tragedy in motion with a casual flick of his wrist. This was the true horror of the shadow growing on the Palatine. It wasn't the heat of the fire. It was the coldness of the calculation. As the year 39 AD progressed, the mechanism began to hum. The initial test cases had proven successful. The families had not revolted. The fathers had swallowed their pride. The Senate had looked at their sandals. Caligula learned the most dangerous lesson a tyrant can learn: no one is going to stop me. And so, the recruitment expanded. The shadow stretched out from the Palatine, down the Via Sacra, creeping into the atrium of every house where a young girl was coming of age. The emperor's insomnia had become the city's nightmare. While he spoke to the moon, Rome lay awake, listening for the sound of heavy boots on the cobblestones, praying that the knock on the door would not come for them. But the knock always came, and it is there, at the door of the unsuspecting, that the machinery of the harvest truly began. To understand the full horror of what happened next, one must discard the image of soldiers kicking down doors in the middle of the night. That is the method of a clumsy tyrant. Caligula was building something far more insidious. The abduction of Rome's daughters was not conducted as a raid. It was conducted as an audit. The officials who fanned out across the city and the surrounding Italian countryside did not carry swords. They carried styluses and wax tablets. They were the curators, imperial functionaries who moved with the quiet confidence of men who know they have the winning hand in a game where the opponent hasn't even realized they are playing. They were not looking for tax evasion or hidden grain stores. They were looking for a very specific type of asset. They scoured Rome with the meticulous eye of a jeweler searching for flaws in a diamond. They frequented the public spaces where the upper classes paraded their status: the porticos of Pompeii, the steps of the temples, the exclusive sections of the circus. But they also had ears in the bathhouses and the marketplaces, listening to the gossip of slaves who bragged about the beauty of their mistresses. The criteria were strict, almost clinical. First, age. They sought those on the cusp of womanhood, the fleeting moment between the innocence of childhood and the responsibilities of marriage. Second, lineage. While beauty was essential, pedigree was the seasoning that Caligula craved. To possess a girl from the Suburra was meaningless. Any man with a few coins could do that. But to possess a girl whose ancestors had defeated Hannibal or built the Forum, that was to possess history itself. But the third condition was the most crucial and the most perverse: purity. Pudicitia. In Roman society, the sexual integrity of a freeborn girl was not just a personal matter. It was the spiritual collateral of her family. It was the foundation of her father's honor and her future husband's status. By targeting this specific quality, Caligula was not just satisfying a physical urge. He was seizing the moral capital of the Roman elite. The visit to the family home usually happened in the morning, during the salutatio, the hour when clients visited their patrons. The imperial official would arrive, not as an intruder, but as a distinguished guest. The father, the paterfamilias, would receive him in the atrium. surrounded by the wax masks of his ancestors watching from the walls. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic coercion. "The emperor has heard of your daughter's virtue," the official might say, sipping wine that the nervous host had poured with a trembling hand. "He wishes to honor your house. There is a need for companions for the divine sisters, or perhaps acolytes for a new rite to Isis within the palace." The words were chosen carefully. Honor, service, privilege. It was a trap baited with the family's own ambition. Rome was a society paralyzed by the desire for status. To be close to the emperor was the ultimate goal of every politician, every knight, every climbing merchant. For a split second, the father might feel a surge of pride. My daughter? Chosen? But then, the cold reality would settle in. Rumors had legs in Rome. Everyone had heard the whispers about the parties on the Palatine. Everyone knew that Drusilla's companions were not weaving tapestries or discussing Stoic philosophy. The father would look at the official, and in the official's flat, unblinking stare, he would see the truth. This was not an invitation. It was a requisition order. This was the moment where the soul of the Roman family fractured. Under Roman law, the paterfamilias held the vitae necisque potestas, the power of life and death over his children. He was the absolute monarch of his home. But faced with the pater patriae, the father of the country, his authority evaporated. If he refused, he wasn't just a protective father, he was a traitor. A refusal was an insult to the emperor's generosity. And insults to Caligula were answered with treason, trials, confiscation of property, exile, or the order to open one's veins in a warm bath. So, the fathers of Rome, the men who ruled the world, found themselves in a suffocating bind. They had to hand over their daughters with a smile. They had to thank the thief who was robbing them. "We are unworthy of such grace," they would stammer, bowing their heads. The mothers, often more attuned to the emotional undercurrents, would stand in the shadows of the peristyle, gripping the folds of their stolas until their knuckles turned white. They knew. They understood that their daughters were being sold to buy the family's safety for another season. But in a world where women's voices were legally silenced, their grief had to be swallowed, dissolved in the necessity of survival. Once the agreement was coerced, the process moved quickly. The officials would ask to see the girl, merely to confirm the reports. She would be brought out, usually confused, dressed in her best tunic, perhaps clutching a favorite trinket or a scroll. The official would inspect her. He would circle her, checking her posture, her teeth, the clarity of her skin, the color of her eyes. It was a livestock inspection disguised as a courtly introduction. He would note her demeanor. Was she docile? Fiery? Shy? Caligula had moods, and the inventory needed to be diverse enough to match them. If she passed the inspection, the date was set. There was no time for long goodbyes. The chariot would arrive at the appointed hour. The genius of the system lay in how it implicated the victim's family. By framing it as an honor, Caligula forced the parents to prepare their daughters for their own victimization. Mothers had to bathe them, scent their hair, and dress them in white, telling them lies to keep them calm. "You are going to a beautiful place," they would whisper, holding back tears. "You will see the emperor. You must be good. You must obey." They sent their children into the wolf's den armed only with obedience. In this way, the harvest of innocence was not just a physical removal of girls from their homes. It was a psychological dismantling of the Roman family unit. The trust between parent and child was severed. The girl leaving her home looked back at her parents and saw them not as protectors, but as accomplices. She saw them waving from the doorway, forcing smiles, abandoning her to the beast on the hill. This betrayal was the first step in breaking the girl's spirit. Before she even reached the palace, she had learned the hardest lesson of Caligula's Rome. No one is coming to save you. Not the laws, not the gods, and not even your father. As the carriages rumbled away, carrying their bewildered cargo toward the Palatine, the silence in the houses left behind was heavy. It was a silence filled with shame. Neighbors would congratulate the family on the great honor. The father would accept the praise in the forum, nodding stoically, while inside he felt the rot of cowardice spreading in his chest. And up on the hill, the registers were updated. Another name, another description, another life converted into a line item in the emperor's grand, dark design. The machinery was perfectly greased, fueled by the fear of the many and the desires of the one. The harvest was plentiful, and the winter of the soul was just beginning. If the Palatine was the crown of Rome, the place known in whispers as the Garden of Venus was its hidden jewel, a jewel that shone with a cold, artificial light. To understand the trap Caligula had set, one must visualize the geography of the prison. It was not a dungeon of damp stone and iron chains. Such places were for enemies of the state, for soldiers and traitors. For the daughters of Rome, the emperor had built a cage that disguised itself as paradise. Historical texts and archaeological reconstructions suggest that the imperial complex was a labyrinth of wings and pavilions. The Garden of Venus was likely located in a secluded sector, perhaps near the Domus Tiberiana, isolated from the busy administrative courts, where senators debated and clerks tallied taxes. It was an architectural marvel designed for a single purpose: to sever the connection between the occupants and the reality outside. The entrance was a transition point, a psychological airlock. As the young women stepped out of the carriages and through the heavy bronze doors, the noise of Rome, the shouting, the carts, the distant hum of life vanished instantly. In its place was a silence so profound it felt manufactured. The space was constructed of polished marble, likely imported from the quarries of Phrygia, white stone veined with violent streaks of purple, resembling bruised flesh. The floors were mosaics of intricate geometric patterns, designed to dazzle the eye and make one lose their sense of direction. Fountains played constantly, the sound of falling water calibrated to soothe the nerves, yet loud enough to mask any sound that might come from the neighboring rooms. The air here was different. It didn't smell of the Tiber or the dust of the streets. It was thick with the scent of saffron, cinnamon, and frankincense aromas that in Rome were associated with the gods. Enormous bronze braziers burned day and night, consuming expensive oils to maintain a temperature that was always warm, always perfect, suspending the passage of seasons. It was a place of eternal spring, but a spring that felt stagnant, breathless. The rooms assigned to the girls were masterpieces of luxury. The walls were adorned with frescoes depicting mythological scenes, but a closer look would reveal the nature of the art. They were not scenes of heroism or civic virtue. They were scenes of abduction and transformation. Europa carried off by the bull, Daphne turning into a laurel tree to escape Apollo, Proserpina dragged into the underworld. The art whispered the truth that the girls were not yet ready to hear. You are here to be consumed. Furniture was draped in Tyrian purple and silks from the distant Ceres, Chine. Fabrics so light they floated on the air. Every object, from the silver mirrors to the ivory combs placed on the bedside tables, was of the highest quality. A visitor, stumbling upon this place by accident, would have thought they had found a sanctuary of unparalleled privilege. But the beauty was a weapon. The sensory overload was calculated. The perfumes were heavy, inducing a state of lethargy. The constant sound of water blurred thoughts. The lack of windows facing the outside world meant that the sun was the only clock, and even that was filtered through screens of alabaster. This environment was the first stage of the psychological conditioning. It was designed to make the girls feel small, to overwhelm their senses until they doubted their own perceptions. How could this be a prison if it smelled like heaven? How could they be in danger if they were surrounded by gold? Caligula had created a Skinner box of luxury. The Garden of Venus was a bubble of unreality floating above the grime of the city. Here, the laws of the Senate did not apply. The moral codes of the ancestors did not exist. The only law was the whim of the man who lived in the apartments above. The garden itself, an internal courtyard open to the sky, was planted with exotic flora brought from the far corners of the empire. Strange flowers with intoxicating scents bloomed alongside statues of nymphs and satyrs, but the garden was enclosed by high walls. The sky was the only exit, and it was too high to reach. The girls would wander these paths, their sandals clicking softly on the stone, touching the leaves of plants they couldn't name. They were birds in a gilded aviary, dazzled by the brightness of the bars. The beauty of the Garden of Venus was undeniable, but it was the beauty of a carnivorous plant. Vibrant, sweet-smelling, and designed to close tight around anything that touched its heart. Within the gilded walls of the Garden of Venus, time began to dissolve. For the young women trapped there, the days lost their names. There were no Nones, no Ides, no Calends. There was only the light, and then the dark, and the suffocating space in between. The routine, or rather, the calculated lack of one, was the second mechanism of control. The human mind craves structure. It seeks patterns to predict threats and safety. Caligula, with an instinctive grasp of psychological torment, denied them this anchor. The mornings began not with a rooster's crow or the bustle of a household, but with the silent entry of servants. These were not the chatty, familiar slaves of their fathers' houses. These attendants were mute shadows, often foreigners who spoke little Latin or pretended not to understand. They moved with a fluidity that was unnerving, their eyes always watching, recording every tremor of a hand, every whispered word, every shed tear. The girls were bathed, oiled, and dressed like dolls. They were given no choice in their attire. One day it might be a simple tunic of white wool, the next, a scandalous robe of translucent Cohen silk. They were being costumed for a play they didn't understand. Food was abundant delicacies that most Romans would see only once in a lifetime. Honeyed dormice, oysters from Britannia, wines spiced with rare herbs. But they ate in a communal dining hall under the gaze of the guards. Silence was often enforced, or if conversation was allowed, it was superficial. They could not ask, "When are we leaving? Have you heard from my father?" Such questions were met with a smile that didn't reach the eyes, or worse, a cold stare that promised repercussions. But the true torture was the waiting. The Garden of Venus functioned as a holding pen. The girls were on call 24 hours a day. A summons could come at high noon, or in the dead of night. It might be a demand to attend a banquet, to sing, to stand still as a statue in a corner, or to be taken to the private quarters of the emperor. This unpredictability bred a constant, high-frequency anxiety. Every footstep in the corridor outside caused hearts to hammer against ribs. Was it for me? Is it my turn? Or am I safe for another hour? The stress of this hypervigilance began to manifest physically. Medical writings of the time, and later analyses of trauma, give us a window into their suffering. Some girls stopped eating, their throats closing up in revolt. Others developed nervous tics pulling at their hair, wringing their hands until the skin was raw. Insomnia was rampant. When they did sleep, they were plagued by nightmares, waking up screaming in the dark, only to be hushed by the impassive servants. Caligula's system also weaponized isolation within the crowd. While there were many girls in the garden, true connection was sabotaged. If two girls were seen whispering too often, or comforting each other with too much familiarity, they would be separated. One would be moved to a different wing, or simply disappear for a few days, returning with a haunted look and a refusal to speak of where she had been. This tactic destroyed solidarity. It made every girl an island of fear. They learned that friendship was dangerous, that caring for another was a weakness that could be exploited. They began to view each other not as sisters in misfortune, but as competitors for safety. If she is chosen tonight, then I am safe. It was a corrosive thought that ate away at their empathy, isolating them further. The luxury that surrounded them became a mockery. The soft beds offered no rest. The sweet wine tasted like ash. They were living in a suspended state of animation. The servants acted as jailers in velvet slippers. They would offer a soothing massage while simultaneously reporting the girl's emotional state to the head of the household. "She is weeping too much," a report might say. "She is defiant. She is broken." These reports determined their treatment. The defiant were punished with subtle cruelties, cold water, isolation, darkness. The broken were used until they were empty. In this environment, the mind begins to fracture. To survive, many of the girls dissociated. They separated their minds from their bodies. They learned to walk, talk, and smile while their true selves retreated deep inside, hiding in a fortress of memory where the emperor could not reach them. They became somnambulists, sleepwalkers in a waking nightmare. This was the captive's routine, a cycle of terror, boredom, and sensory confusion designed to erase the person they were and replace her with a compliant vessel, ready to be filled with the emperor's will. Among the many shadows that walked the marble halls, one story emerges from the fragments of history to give a face to the tragedy. Let us call her Livia. She was 14 years old, the age when Roman girls began to put away their dolls and prepare for the gravity of marriage. She was not a princess of the blood, nor a destitute plebeian. She was the daughter of a knight, a man of good standing who had made a modest fortune in the shipping trade and was desperate to secure a seat in the Senate. Her family lived on the Caelian hill, in a comfortable domus with a small garden where Livia spent her afternoons weaving and listening to her mother read poetry. Livia was described in family letters preserved by pure chance in the dry sands of Egypt, where her brother later served as bright-eyed and gentle of spirit. She loved the stories of Aeneas and Dido. She had a pet thrush that she fed by hand. She was, in every sense, a normal child of Rome, protected by the walls of her home and the status of her father. But protection in Caligula's Rome was an illusion. The day the officials arrived at her father's house was a crisp morning in March. The sky was a piercing blue, the kind of Roman spring day that makes the city feel eternal and benevolent. Livia was in the atrium, adjusting the folds of her toga, when the heavy knocker sounded on the front door. The sound echoed through the house, silencing the chatter of the slaves. Her father received the visitors with a bluster of forced hospitality. But Livia, peeking from behind a pillar, saw his hands shaking as he accepted the wax tablet they offered. She saw the color drain from his face. She saw her mother, standing rigid by the household shrine, close her eyes as if in prayer or in pain. The conversation was brief. The officials did not ask, they informed. Livia had been selected. Her name had appeared on a list. Her beauty had been noted by a friend of the emperor. She was to pack her things. A carriage would arrive at sunset. When her father broke the news to her, he did not look her in the eye. He spoke of honor, of opportunity, of how this would elevate the family name. He spoke with the desperate speed of a man trying to convince himself. "You will serve the divine house," he said. "You will be near the center of the world." But Livia looked at her mother, and in her mother's weeping, she saw the truth. There was no honor here. This was a sacrifice. Her father was trading her for his own safety, for the hope that the emperor's gaze would pass over his fortune if he gave up his flesh and blood. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Servants packed trunks with her finest tunics. Her mother brushed her hair, counting the strokes, weeping silently, her tears falling onto Livia's shoulders. She gave Livia a small amulet, a golden bulla meant to ward off evil spirits. "Hide this," she whispered fiercely, pressing it into Livia's palm. "Never take it off. Remember who you are." Livia moved through the day like a ghost in her own life. She touched the walls of her room, the loom she would never finish, the cage of her bird. She felt a cold numbness spreading from her chest to her fingertips. She wanted to scream, to grab her father's tunic and beg him to hide her, to send her away to the country, to do something, anything. But she was a Roman daughter. Obedience was her first language. She had been raised to believe that her life belonged to her father, to dispose of as he saw fit. If he said this was her duty, then it must be her duty. As the sun began to dip behind the Capitoline Hill, painting the city in shades of blood and gold, the carriage arrived. It was black, with curtains drawn tight. The horses stamped impatiently on the paving stones. Livia stood at the threshold of her home. Her father kissed her forehead, his lips dry and cold. "Make us proud," he choked out. Her mother squeezed her hand one last time, a grip so tight it hurt, transmitting a message of desperate, helpless love. Livia stepped out of the safety of her childhood and climbed into the dark interior of the carriage. The door clicked shut. The wheels began to turn. As the carriage lurched forward, taking her away from the only life she had ever known, she did not know that she was traveling toward the edge of an abyss. She was just a 14-year-old girl clutching a golden amulet in the dark, wondering why her father hadn't saved her. The journey from the Caelian Hill to the Palatine was short in distance, but infinite in consequence. As the carriage rattled over the basalt stones of the Via Sacra, Livia could hear the muffled sounds of the city fading. The shouts of street vendors, the barking of dogs, the chaotic symphony of Rome. It all dropped away, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the steep incline of the road. When the carriage finally stopped, it wasn't before a fortress, but a palace of blinding white. The air here was cooler, cleaner, removed from the dust of the valley below. Livia stepped out, her legs trembling, clutching her mother's amulet so tightly the metal bit into her palm. She expected severity. She expected the cold indifference of a military camp or the rigid discipline of a temple. What she found was far more disarming, a suffocating, artificial kindness. She was met not by guards with spears, but by women with soft voices and hands that smelled of lavender. They did not push her. They guided her. They did not command. They invited. "Welcome, little dove," one of them cooed, leading her through a corridor lined with statues of gods who seemed to be looking away. "You must be tired. The emperor wishes for you to be refreshed." This was the first phase of the psychological dismantling, a tactic modern psychologists call love bombing. Before the terror, there must be confusion. By overwhelming the victim with luxury and apparent affection, the predator disarms their natural defenses. Livia had prepared herself to be brave in the face of hardship. She had not prepared herself to be drowned in honey. She was taken to a bathhouse that made her father's private baths look like a cattle trough. The water was heated to the temperature of blood. Steam rose from the pools, carrying the scent of rosewater and jasmine. Servants stripped away her travel-stained tunic, the clothes of her old life, and lowered her into the water. They washed her hair with oils imported from Judea, massaged her limbs with unguents that made her skin tingle, and fed her slices of peach that tasted of summer. "See," the women whispered as they combed her hair with ivory picks. "You are a princess here. There is nothing to fear. You are favored." For a few hours, the terror in Livia's chest began to loosen, replaced by a dizzying bewilderment. Was it possible her father was right? Was this truly a place of honor? Perhaps she would serve Drusilla's memory. Perhaps she would be trained to play the lyre for the court. The luxury was so absolute that it seemed to erase the possibility of evil. Evil was supposed to be ugly. This place was beautiful. They dressed her in a tunic of silk so fine it felt like water against her skin. It was not the modest wool stola of a Roman matron, but something diaphanous, shimmering in the lamplight. They placed a wreath of golden laurels on her head. Livia looked in the silver mirror they held up for her. The girl staring back was beautiful, ethereal, a creature of myth, but she didn't recognize her. The Livia of the Caelian Hill, the girl who fed thrushes and wove wool, was gone. In her place was a doll, painted and polished, ready to be placed on a shelf. She sat on the edge of a bed covered in Tyrian purple, waiting for instructions that did not come. The kindness had disarmed her, stripping away her shield of fear, leaving her soft and vulnerable. She didn't know it, but she had just been prepared like a sacrificial lamb, garlanded, washed, and unaware that the knife was already being sharpened. The summons did not come with a shout, but with a whisper. The sun had set hours ago. The Garden of Venus was bathed in the flickering light of oil lamps. Livia had almost fallen asleep, exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the day, when the door to her chamber opened. 2 Praetorian guards stood there. They wore the crested helmets and lacquered breastplates of the elite, but their faces were blank, professional, terrifyingly empty. "It is time," one of them said. They didn't drag her. They simply turned and walked, knowing she had no choice but to follow. Livia rose, her legs feeling like lead. She walked out of the quiet sanctuary of the women's quarters and into the belly of the beast. As they approached the triclinium, the great dining hall, the noise hit her first. It wasn't the rowdy cheer of a tavern. It was a low, intense hum of conversation, punctuated by the sharp clinking of silver cups and the strained laughter of men who were afraid to stop laughing. The air grew thick with the smell of roasted meats, strong Falernian wine, and heavy incense. The guard stopped at the great bronze doors. They swung open. Livia stepped into a cavern of gold and marble. Hundreds of lamps burned from the ceiling, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Reclining on couches arranged in a semicircle were the most powerful men in the world. Senators in their purple-bordered togas, generals with scars from the Rhine, wealthy equestrians. And at the center of it all, reclining on a couch elevated above the rest, was Caligula. He was younger than she expected. His face was pale, his eyes deep-set and burning with a feverish intensity. He wore not a toga, but a silk robe embroidered with pearls, and on his finger, a ring that caught the light like a star. He was not eating. He was watching. When Livia entered, the room did not go silent immediately. But as the emperor's gaze shifted to her, the silence spread outward from him like a wave, until the only sound was the crackle of the torches. Livia stood alone on the mosaic floor. She felt tiny, a speck of dust in a hurricane. Hundreds of eyes crawled over her. They were not eyes of admiration. They were eyes of assessment. They looked at her the way a buyer looks at a horse at auction, checking the lines, the teeth, the spirit. "Come closer," Caligula said. His voice was soft, high-pitched, almost gentle. Livia forced her feet to move. She walked toward the center of the room, every step an agony of exposure. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the burning shame of being displayed. She was no longer a daughter of a Roman knight. She was an object, a curiosity, a prop in the emperor's dinner theater. She stopped a few paces from his couch. She kept her eyes on the floor, afraid to look at the god king, afraid that if she looked, she would turn to stone. "Look at me," he commanded. She raised her head. For a second, their eyes met. In that moment, Livia saw no lust, no anger. She saw a terrifying boredom. He was looking at her not as a human being with a soul, but as a mechanism to be tested. He reached out a hand, his fingers heavy with rings, and touched the silk of her sleeve. He didn't touch her skin, but the invasion felt total. He turned to the senator on his right, a man Livia vaguely recognized as a friend of her father. "Is she not exquisite, Valerius?" Caligula asked, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "A perfect example of Roman virtue. We must thank her father for his generosity." The senator, Valerius, pale and sweating, raised his cup with a trembling hand. A great honor, Caesar. Truly." The laughter that followed was brittle, nervous. Livia felt the world tilting. The humiliation was not in violence. It was in this public dismantling of her humanity. She was being used to test the loyalty of these men. By accepting her presence here, by complimenting her beauty while she stood terrified and alone, they were all complicit in her captivity. Caligula smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't touch his eyes. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, as if she were a bored servant. "Take her back. She is not ripe yet." Livia turned and walked away, the laughter of the room chasing her like a pack of wolves. She had survived the first encounter, but something inside her had shattered. She realized then that the palace was not a home, and she was not a guest. She was a toy in a room full of children who broke things just to see how they worked. The tragedy of the Palatine was not merely what Caligula did, but what everyone else failed to do. To focus only on the emperor is to miss the true horror of the system. The machine required gears, and those gears were the senators, the generals, and the magistrates of Rome, men who commanded legions and governed provinces, yet who sat paralyzed in the presence of a 27-year-old man. This was the theater of complicity. Caligula understood the psychology of power better than any philosopher. He knew that if he committed an atrocity in secret, it was just a crime. But if he forced the elite of Rome to watch it, to applaud it, to participate in it, then he made them partners. He stained their hands with the same guilt. And a man who shares your guilt is a man who will never betray you. Because exposing you means exposing himself. The banquets were the stage for this psychological warfare. When young women like Livia were paraded before the court, Caligula was watching the audience as closely as he watched the girls. He looked for a flinch of disgust in a general's eye. He listened for a hesitation in a senator's praise. He watched to see if anyone would dare to look away. To look away was treason. It implied judgment. It implied that the emperor's actions were shameful. So, the men of Rome learned to stare. They learned to smile at the humiliation of their peers' daughters. They learned to clap when the emperor made a cruel joke about a girl's fear. Consider the position of a senator at one of these dinners. He sits on a couch, eating pheasant, while the daughter of his colleague is displayed like livestock. He feels the bile rising in his throat. He knows this is an abomination against the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. But he also knows that behind the curtains, the Praetorian Guard is listening. He knows that Caligula has a list of names in his pocket. He knows that one word of protest will not save the girl, but it will doom his own wife and children to death. So, he swallows the bile. He raises his cup. He laughs. "Hail, Caesar," he says. "Your taste is divine." This collective cowardice created a feedback loop. Caligula pushed the boundaries further and further, testing the limits of their submission. If I take their daughters, they say nothing. What if I take their wives? What if I force them to serve me like slaves? And every time, Rome said yes. The silence was not passive. It was active work. It required a constant suppression of conscience. The palace became a place where reality was suspended. Acts that would have caused a riot in the forum were normalized within the gilded walls of the dining hall. The abnormal became the routine. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recount that Caligula openly mocked these men to their faces. He would kiss a senator's wife in front of him, then critique her performance to the husband during dinner. And the husband would nod, humiliated, terrified, broken. This dynamic destroyed the moral fabric of the Roman elite. They could no longer claim to be the guardians of the state. They were accomplices to its rape. The shame of their cowardice ate at them, making them hate Caligula even more, but also making them hate themselves. And in the center of this moral vacuum were the girls. They looked out at the faces of Rome's most powerful men, men who were supposed to be the fathers of the Republic and saw only masks of fear. They realized that there was no one to appeal to. The law had left the building. Justice was just a word carved into stone in the forum, miles away. Here, in the flickering light of the banquet, the only truth was power. The theater of complicity ensured that the screams of the Palatine never reached the streets. The walls were made of marble, but the mortar was silence. And that silence was maintained not just by the emperor, but by every man who valued his life more than his soul. If the banquets were the theater, the private quarters were the marketplace. As the reign of Caligula stretched on, the initial shock of the system gave way to a darker, more transactional reality. The emperor, ever the innovator in cruelty, began to tire of mere display. Possession was not enough. He needed to degrade the value of what he possessed to prove that nothing in Rome, neither virtue nor lineage, had any intrinsic worth. The historical sources speak of a descent into commercialization of the palace. While Suetonius famously wrote of Caligula opening a brothel on the Palatine to humiliate the Senate and raise funds, the reality within the Garden of Venus was more subtle and far more insidious. It was here that the commodification of virtue took place. In the intimate gatherings that followed the great feasts, Caligula began to treat the women of the nobility not as guests, nor even as captives, but as currency. He would turn to a favored general or a hesitant magistrate and offer them a gift for the evening. "Take her," he would say, gesturing to a daughter of the Cornelii or the Julii as one might gesture to a bowl of fruit. "She is bored. Entertain her." This was the ultimate trap. For the man receiving the offer, the moment was a precipice. To refuse was to insult the emperor's generosity, a crime that could lead to the arena. To accept was to participate in the violation of his own class, to break the sacred laws of Roman society that protected the daughters of citizens. But in the suffocating atmosphere of the Palatine, moral codes crumbled before the instinct for survival. Most accepted. They took the trembling girls by the arm, avoiding their eyes, and led them away to the private alcoves. In doing so, they sold their honor to buy another day of life. For Livia and the others, this was the final shattering of their worldview. They had been raised to believe that their virtue was their shield, that their status as Roman citizens made them inviolable. Now, they learned that they were interchangeable, loanable, disposable. Resistance was attempted. At first, there were whispers of girls who refused, who scratched faces or screamed for their fathers. But the system had a remedy for defiance. It was not the lash that would leave marks that ruined the aesthetic, but psychological erosion. A girl who resisted was not beaten. She was isolated. She would be locked in a room where the lamps were never extinguished, robbing her of sleep for days. Or she would be placed in total darkness, with sounds of weeping piped in through the walls, until she could not distinguish her own voice from the manufactured sorrow. Or, most cruelly, she would be told that her resistance had caused her family to be arrested. "Your father is in chains because you would not smile," quote a servant would whisper. "Do you want him to die?" Under this pressure, the will to fight evaporated. The girls learned that the only path to a modicum of safety was total, passive submission. They learned to become statues. A statue does not feel pain. A statue does not cry. A statue endures the touch of a stranger and waits for the sun to rise. This was the Pax Caligula within the palace, a peace built on the absolute obliteration of consent. The men of Rome learned that their lust was law if sanctioned by the emperor, and the women of Rome learned that their bodies were no longer their own. The transaction was complete. The soul of the empire was being sold, night after night, in the quiet, perfumed rooms of the Palatine. The human mind is resilient, but it is not unbreakable. When subjected to chronic, inescapable stress, it begins to reconfigure itself to survive. In the Garden of Venus, where the threat was constant and the logic of the world was inverted, the young women underwent a slow, internal erosion. As weeks turned into months, the initial terror, the adrenaline, the tears, the desperate prayers to Juno faded. In its place came a hollow silence. The physicians of the court, men trained in the Greek traditions of Hippocrates, began to note a strange set of symptoms among the guests. They recorded these observations in wax tablets that would later be lost or destroyed, but the echoes of their findings remain in the fragmented descriptions of the era. They wrote of melancholia atonita, a stunned melancholy. The girls stopped asking about their families. They stopped counting the days. They developed what modern psychology calls the 1,000-yard stare, a gaze that looks through walls and people, focusing on a point in the distance that no one else can see. It is the look of a soldier who has seen too much, or a prisoner who has forgotten what freedom feels like. Livia, once bright and full of stories about Aeneas, began to lose her words. She found that if she stayed very still, if she made herself small and gray, she might be overlooked. She stopped eating the rich food, subsisting on bread and water, as if starving her body could shrink her presence in the world. The psychological torture was compounded by the double bind, a technique Caligula mastered instinctively. He would be monstrous one night, and the next morning, he would send a girl a gift, a singing bird, a jeweled comb with a note praising her grace. This oscillation between terror and kindness shattered their reality. It made them doubt their own memories. Was he really a monster? Or am I ungrateful? It created a trauma bond, a dependency where the victim looks to the abuser for the only signs of safety available. Furthermore, the system was designed to destroy solidarity. In the beginning, the girls had tried to comfort one another. They would hold hands in the dark, whisper stories of their homes, promise that they would survive together. But the overseers of the garden watched for these bonds. Friendship was an act of rebellion. If Livia was seen comforting another girl, they were immediately separated. The friend would be moved to the other side of the complex. Livia would be told that her friend had been sent home or had spoken ill of her. Lies were planted like weeds to choke out trust. Soon, the girls stopped speaking to each other. They walked the garden paths alone, wrapped in their own individual spheres of misery. The isolation was absolute. They were surrounded by people, yet they were the loneliest souls in Rome. The erosion of the soul is not a loud event. It is not a dramatic crack. It is the slow wearing away of stone by water. It is the fading of color until everything is gray. Livia forgot the sound of her mother's voice. She forgot the smell of the atrium in the Caelian hill. She forgot who she was. She became a vessel, a shell that moved and breathed and obeyed. But inside, the lights had been turned off, one by one, until only the darkness remained. While the lights were going out inside the Palatine, outside, in the villas and tenements of Rome, a different kind of darkness was spreading. It was the darkness of knowledge held in silence. The families of the abducted girls lived in a purgatory of their own, making a mix of social pride and private agony. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence to survive, referenced in later ecclesiastical archives, is the so-called Letter of Ennia. Ennia was the wife of a Roman senator, a woman of high standing. Her niece, a girl of 15 named Drusilla, named after the emperor's sister in a futile attempt to gain favor, had been taken to the palace 6 months earlier. The letter, written to her sister in the provinces, breaks the code of silence that governed Rome. It is a cry of despair muffled by the fear of interception. "We saw her yesterday," Ennia writes, her stylus digging deep into the wax, "at the games of Apollo. She was seated in the imperial box, dressed in white and gold, like a goddess. The people cheered her beauty. My husband squeezed my hand and told me to smile, to show gratitude for the honor. But Ennia saw what the crowd did not. She is thin, sister, so thin that the bracelets slipped on her wrists. But it was her face that frightened me. She looked at us, her own kin, and she did not recognize us. Her eyes were like the marble eyes of a statue in a tomb open, but seeing nothing. She smiled when the emperor laughed, but the smile did not reach her soul. It was a mask painted on a corpse." Ennia describes the torture of the aftermath. After the games, a messenger brought them a gift from the palace, a silver bowl filled with dates and a message thanking the family for their loyal contribution to the joy of the empire. "We had to write a letter of thanks," Ennia confesses. "We had to thank the beast for devouring our child. My husband wept while he wrote it, but he wrote it. What else could we do? If we speak, we die. And if we die, who will be there if she ever comes home?" This was the trap. The families were held hostage by hope. They told themselves that if they played the game, if they remained loyal, if they swallowed the humiliation, their daughters might be returned. They sacrificed the truth to save the life. But Ennia's letter reveals the cracks in this denial. "I fear," she concludes, "that the girl who left us is gone forever. The body remains, but the spirit has been eaten. We are mourning the living, and we cannot even wear black." The letter of Ennia stands as a testament to the thousands of parents who were forced to become accomplices in the destruction of their own children. It shows us that the walls of the Palatine extended far beyond the hill. They wrapped around the heart of every family that had something to lose, turning the entire city into a prison of complicity. The tyranny of Caligula seemed eternal, as tyrannies always do to those living under them. He was a god. He was the law. He was the sun around which Rome revolved. But gods made of flesh have a fatal flaw. They bleed. The end of the nightmare did not come from a noble uprising of the people to save the innocent. It did not come from a senate reclaiming its dignity. The tragedy of history is that the suffering of women rarely moves empires to action. The fall of Caligula came from a petty grievance, a bruise to a soldier's ego. Cassius Chaerea was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a veteran of the Germanic Wars. He was a killer, a man of iron, but he had a high-pitched voice, and Caligula, with his childish delight and mockery, tormented him relentlessly. He gave him humiliating passwords like Venus or Priapus. He taunted him in front of the troops. It was this the insult to a man's pride that forged the dagger, not the cries from the Garden of Venus. On January 24, 41 AD, the tension that had gripped Rome for nearly 4 years finally snapped. It was the final day of the Palatine Games. The palace was a chaotic swirl of actors, slaves, and courtiers. Caligula, feeling unwell from a heavy lunch, decided to take a shortcut through the Crypto Porticus, a long underground corridor that connected the palaces. It was a tunnel of shadows. Chaerea and his co-conspirators were waiting. There were no speeches about liberty, just the brutal, wet sound of metal-piercing flesh. The god fell in the dust, screaming, pleading, until the silence finally reclaimed him. He died as he had lived, surrounded by violence, yet utterly alone. Up in the Garden of Venus, the change was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, the routine was absolute. The servants were watching, the guards were posted. The fear was a solid thing. The next moment, a roar rose from the lower levels. The sound of running feet, of screaming, of metal clashing on stone. Then, the doors opened. But no one came in. The guards who had stood watch for months simply vanished, melting away to save their own skins or join the looting. The servants fled, dropping trays of silver and bundles of silk. Livia was in her room when the silence broke. She heard the shouting, but it wasn't the usual sound of a feast. It was the sound of panic. She stepped into the corridor. For the first time in 2 years, there was no one to tell her to go back. The girls gathered in the central atrium of the garden. They stood in a huddle, trembling. The cage door was open, but the bird did not know how to fly. They didn't cheer. They didn't run. They were paralyzed by the sudden removal of the gravity that had held them down. Was it a trick? Was this another test? If they stepped outside, would the emperor be waiting to punish them? The chaos of the assassination created a vacuum. For several hours, while the Senate argued and the soldiers looted, the girls of the Garden of Venus existed in a strange limbo. They were free, yet they were trapped by the conditioning that had rewired their brains. They waited for an order that would never come. It was the most terrifying moment of all, the realization that the monster was dead, but the world he had built around them was still standing. When the dust settled, Claudius was pulled from behind a curtain and declared emperor. He was an old man, a stammerer, a survivor who wanted stability above all else. He looked at the wreckage of Caligula's reign, the empty treasury, the angry Senate, the traumatized court, and he made a pragmatic decision. He would not expose the crimes of the past. He would bury them. The problem of the Garden of Venus was handled with administrative coldness. There could be no public acknowledgement of what had happened. To admit that the emperor had systematically enslaved the daughters of the nobility would be to admit that the empire itself was rotten. It would shame the families involved and weaken the institution of the principate. So, the cleanup began. Carriages were sent to the Palatine at night. This time, there was no pageantry. The girls were loaded into them quickly, like contraband being returned to a warehouse. They were sent back to their fathers' homes with gifts, chests of gold, deeds to land, jewels. These were not apologies. They were bribes. The price of silence. Livia returned to the Caelian Hill 2 years after she had left. She walked through the door of her father's house, wearing a cloak given to her by the new administration. Her mother wept and tried to embrace her. Her father stood awkwardly, unable to look her in the face. They tried to pretend that she had just been away on a long journey. They prepared a feast. They spoke of the future. "Now, you can marry," her father said, his voice too loud. "Now life begins." But life did not begin. The Livia who returned was not the Livia who had left. The trauma of the Palatine did not vanish because the emperor was dead. It lived in the way she flinched when a door slammed. It lived in her inability to sleep without a light burning. It lived in the sudden, crushing panic that would seize her in the middle of a sunny afternoon. Reintegration was a second torture. The families, desperate to forget their own cowardice, pressured the girls to move on. They didn't want to hear about the nights of terror. They wanted their daughters to be normal again so they could stop feeling guilty. "It is over," they would say. "Forget it." But you cannot forget the breaking of your own soul. Many of the girls could not re-assimilate. Some, like the niece of Enya, fell into a permanent state of withdrawal, living as recluses in the back rooms of their villas, ghosts haunting the living. Others, unable to bear the weight of the memories and the suffocating silence of a society that refused to acknowledge their pain, chose the only exit left to them. Suicide rates among these women were never recorded officially. Roman history does not count such things, but the gaps in the genealogies speak volumes. Young women who died of fever or suddenly in the years following 41 AD. For Livia, freedom was not a liberation. It was an exile into a world that no longer made sense. She had survived the monster, but she could not survive the silence. She lived, but she lived as a stranger in her own skin, carrying the shadow of the Palatine within her until her last breath. The Palatine Hill stands in ruins today. The marble is gone, stripped away by popes and princes to build new palaces. The gold has been melted down. The Garden of Venus is nothing but broken brick and weeds growing in the cracks of history. We walk these ruins as tourists, snapping photos, imagining the glory of the Caesars. We tell the stories of Caligula's madness, the horse he made a consul, the war against the sea because they are entertaining. They are safe. They allow us to dismiss him as a lunatic, an aberration. But the story of the girls in white, the story of Livia, tells us something much more uncomfortable. It tells us that Caligula was not an anomaly. He was a product of a system that concentrated absolute power in the hands of one man and demanded absolute silence from everyone else. The historians of the ancient world, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, wrote about the politics, the wars, the great men. They mention the women only in passing, as victims or villains. Footnotes in the grand narrative of male power. The names of the girls from the Garden of Venus were erased, scrubbed from the records to protect the honor of their families. But their silence echoes across the millennia. It echoes in every system where the powerful are protected by a wall of complicity. It echoes in the institutions of our own time, in the corporations, the churches, the industries where abuse is covered up to protect the reputation of the organization, where victims are paid to be quiet, where families and colleagues look the other way because the cost of speaking out is too high. Caligula is dead, but the mechanism he perfected is still alive. The logic that treats human beings as commodities, that values prestige over truth, that sacrifices the vulnerable to appease the powerful. This logic did not die in the Cryptoporticus in 41 AD. We tell this story not just to remember Livia and the thousands like her whose names we will never know. We tell it to break the silence that buried them. Memory is the only justice we can offer the dead. By bringing their story out of the shadows, by refusing to look away as the Roman Senate did, we grant them the dignity they were denied in life. The ruins of the Palatine are silent now. But if you listen closely, past the noise of the modern city, you can hear the whisper of the wind through the pines. It is a reminder. Power without accountability is a monster that eats its own children. And the only thing necessary for that monster to thrive is for good men and women to say nothing.